Hi, good morning. This is the 2nd of January, 2022. We've made it to a new year. Thank the Lord. And we are going to start off by hitting the ground running. We are going to look at Romans, and there are parts of Romans that we can look at an extended amount of passages, and there are other parts of Romans that we need to stop. We need to slow down. We need to just slow the pace down so that we make sure that we understand what Paul is talking about. We can understand what the words mean and why they are crucially important for Paul's argument. And in order to do that, sometimes we have to look at a smaller section of Scripture, and that's kind of what we're going to look at today. But it's important because this is also the purpose statement of Romans. The letters of Paul have a purpose statement somewhere, generally in the first chapter, and they usually tell you what the entire subject of the letter is going to be about. So there's a nice purpose statement there, and then that purpose statement gets unpacked. And it's usually good to make sure that as you're reading through the letters of Paul, that one, you identify that purpose statement, and two, your reading of the rest of the letter makes sense with Paul's own given purpose statement. If you interpret the letter differently than the way that Paul defines in his purpose statement, then perhaps you have taken a wrong turn, and that's not very helpful. And I will argue that many people have probably accidentally taken a wrong turn in their interpretation of Romans because they have failed to understand the purpose statement. So we're going to take the time to look at that today. So let's go ahead and share what we have. Okay. We got a full screen. Everything looks good. Looks good. Thumbs up. Awesome. Okay. All right. So today we're going to be focusing on Romans 1:16 through 17. Particularly, we are going to look at defining God's righteousness. There's going to be a phrase in verse 17, which will be translated as God's righteousness or the righteousness of God. And we need to define that because my experience in teaching people in Christian communities for, 20 years now, is that most people cannot confidently tell me what God's righteousness is. Righteousness is this big fuzzy church word, and people just don't really know what it means because it's not a concept that we typically use. I will tell you this, though, that there is a difference between the righteousness that God has and the righteousness that we have. Okay, and so you can't just sit there and define righteousness. You have to determine to whom is this righteousness being assigned. All right. So let's look at the passage for today. Okay, so this is the purpose statement of Romans, and I'm reading out of the NASB with one small change. So verses 16 through 17, Paul says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it, namely in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, but the righteous one shall live by faith." Okay. Namely, it's that passage, the quotation there from Habakkuk, has God speaking and God describing just a righteous person, just one of the people of God, that undesignated righteous person will live by faith, or they will live by faithfulness. Okay. So it's not the righteous man, it's just the righteous person. Okay, but that's God speaking. Okay, God is not the righteous one there. That's God speaking of somebody else. Okay. All right, so this is the purpose statement of Romans, and there's a lot to talk about with it. Okay, so the letters of Paul each have a purpose statement that portrays the main theme that is to be unpacked as the letter continues. This purpose statement speaks about the power of the gospel, why Paul is not ashamed of it, what the gospel does for both Jews and Gentiles, what is revealed in the gospel, and a scriptural citation to prove Paul's argument. So you can see there's a lot there in just these small 2 verses. And we're going to take the time to look at each of those really crucial parts. Okay. But there is something that I think we need to call attention to, and it's this conjunction for, and it's appeared in our passage quite a few times. And you need to understand, if you're going to be a serious reader of Paul, how we need to look for this particular conjunction and what it actually means as Paul gives his statement. Because basically, whenever you see the word for, it means that Paul is going to unpack the statement that he has just said, and he's going to dig down deeper, down to the foundation, and he's going to explain why what he just said makes sense by looking at its foundation. But what we see actually in our purpose statement is that Paul uses the word for, I think, like 3 or 4 times. And so it's like he makes a statement, he needs to unpack it and dig the foundation. And then he needs to look at the foundation of that statement. And then he needs to look at the foundation of that statement. And by the time you have 2 or 3 of these fors, F-O-R, the conjunction for, we have really hit kind of like rock bottom. We've hit the foundation, and we can understand why what he has said is actually true. I think to myself of what I was like growing up when my parents would say something and I would say, why? Because I wanted to know why. I wanted to know what is the reason, what are the reasons behind what you're saying? And Paul is going to give us the reasons behind that. So it's important that we're able to trace this. Okay. So he starts off in verse 16. He says, for I am not ashamed of the gospel. Okay, there's already right there unpacking something he's previously said. So if we want to get at what was previously said based on verse 16, you have to go back and look at verse 15. So the for serves to unpack Paul's previous statement regarding his eager desire to preach the gospel to the readers in Rome. Paul says, I want to come to Rome. I want to preach the gospel to you. Okay, why does Paul want to preach the gospel to us? For I am not ashamed of the gospel. Okay, why is Paul not ashamed of the gospel? For it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. Okay, so this particular for serves to unpack why Paul is not ashamed of the gospel, and of course, it is detailing his specific line of thinking. Okay, all right. So there's Paul is not ashamed of the gospel because the gospel is God's power leading to salvation to all people, to every person, to each person who believes, who demonstrates faithfulness. And then he makes sure that it's for the Jews and the Gentiles equally, the Jews and the Greek equally, although there was a temporal priority for the Jews because the Jews were the chosen people of God in the Old Testament. We'll come back and talk about these. Okay. So then in verse 17, he gets to the final sense of unpacking. Okay. So for in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, that the righteous one shall live by faith. And so this final for hits rock bottom for Paul, showing why salvation is given to everyone who believes. As God's own righteousness is revealed, and this revelation is in continuity with what Scripture has taught. Okay? So the reason why Paul wants to go to Rome and preach the gospel, the reason why he's not ashamed to preach this gospel, and the reason why God's power for salvation is being revealed for everyone, for Jews and Gentiles alike, is because of this phrase, the righteousness of God, God's righteousness. God's righteousness is being revealed. Okay, so that's the rock bottom. That is the foundation of Paul's argument here. And as we can see, it's the foundation of the purpose statement of Romans. So you can understand, if you don't know what the righteousness of God means, you don't understand the foundation of this purpose statement, and you're probably not going to understand the big picture of Romans. And so this is why it's very important that we take the time to really unpack and make sure that we are well educated, that we are clear in our minds, and we are comfortable with this particular topic. Okay, and that's what we're gonna do today. That's what we're gonna look at. Okay, so before we get to the righteousness of God in verse 17, we need to kind of look at verse 16 and its particular key points. Okay, so I have the passage up there; you can see it. Okay, and so Paul says that he's not ashamed. Okay, and so it's not hard for me to think of what Jesus talked about being ashamed here in Mark 8:38. Jesus said, "For whoever is ashamed of me and my words, the Son of Man will also be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory of his Father." Okay, so we don't want to be ashamed of Jesus and his teachings, Jesus and his words. Okay, and of course, one of the primary teachings, the most important teaching that Jesus ever gave, is the teaching about the kingdom of God, namely that his own gospel message, his saving good news, is about the kingdom of God that has drawn near. The reign of God, the redemptive reign of God, is the crux of Jesus's saving gospel message. Okay, all right. So Jesus said we should not be ashamed of his teachings and his words, which obviously include his gospel. And Paul, who also has the gospel because Jesus taught him the gospel. Paul tells us that in Galatians 1 in his own autobiography. Paul says that he is not ashamed of the gospel. Okay, that's good. Okay, all right. Jesus says we shouldn't be ashamed. Paul's not ashamed. So we also should not be ashamed. Okay, and here it's very interesting. In no ambiguous words, Paul says the gospel is the power of God. Okay, not just the gospel is powerful or the gospel does powerful things. The gospel is God's power. I think that's really interesting because I think if I were to ask Christians, what is the power of God? I think a lot of people would say, well, the power of God is the Holy Spirit. Maybe that's what you would think. Maybe you would naturally think that, at least in Paul's theology, the power of God is the Holy Spirit, okay? And I don't want to say that's untrue, okay, because certainly God's Spirit demonstrates God's power, but I think it's very interesting here to see what Paul is saying about the importance and the significance of the gospel, the good news, okay? The message about the crucified and risen King of the kingdom of God. That message, that spoken proclamation, is God's power. God's power for what? God's power for salvation, okay? And so we have to set this in the context of the Roman Empire, and we see here that we have God's salvation against Rome's salvation that Rome tried to implement through war and imperialism. Remember, they brought salvation and peace and security to the world by conquering it, okay? So Rome had their own salvation that was brought by their own Son of God, who was described as the Savior and the Lord, and he brought peace. And discussing that particular salvation was described as gospel, according to Roman imperial propagandists. Okay, but here Paul is talking about a different gospel, about the true God who brings about a real salvation. That's not brought about through imperialism and war. It's brought about through the suffering and the death of the Son of God to bring about peace and the defeat of evil and the defeat of sin and ultimately the defeat of death. Okay. All right. So there's more we can say on that, but we need to move on. Okay. And then it's interesting here that this salvation is for everyone who believes. Okay. It's important that we understand that believing means to be faithful. Okay, the one who believes, and this is actually what is called in Greek a present participle, the one who is believing, the one who is going on and continually believing throughout their entire life. Okay, it's not they believed once in the past and they stopped, like it was a one-time belief. Okay, or they had faith once in the past and that was done. No, the one who is believing, the one who is being faithful, who is demonstrating allegiance. Okay, so again, this word for belief also means to be faithful, also means to be allegiant, and it's a present participle describing the ongoing, continuing action that someone has. And just for the sake of the Calvinist, I have to make clear here that Paul says that this gospel is for everyone who believes, not just for a select few that God has preordained back in prehistory, as opposed to the others that have been preordained for destruction. No, anyone who wants to believe, anyone who wants to show faithfulness and loyalty and allegiance as a lifelong commitment, God's salvation is available unto them. Okay. So great news. Okay. It's open to all people. Okay. But the requirements on your part are very specific. Okay. You have to go on believing. You have to go on being faithful. You have to go on being allegiant. And then he's clear here that although there is a temporal priority for the Jews in the history of God, the Gentiles are considered equal recipients of salvation. So it's to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Okay, so Paul wants to make a statement here, which is going to, of course, define, because he's going to go back in Romans and he's going to talk about the history of God, the history of the world, and how God chose the children of Israel to be the people through whom God was going to bring about restoration, blessings, God's love, God's kingship. So God's salvation began with the Israelites, began ultimately with the Jewish people, but it now has gone throughout to the Greeks, to the Gentiles. And so, we have to remember that in the Roman church, okay, there's a little bit of uncomfortable, how do we get along? Because we have Jewish Christians and we have Gentile Christians. The Gentile Christians might think that they're better than the Jewish Christians. The Jewish Christians might have some personal pride of race. We were born as the people of God. And Paul makes a statement here to make sure that neither of the two think that they are better than one another. The gospel goes to everyone who believes. Yeah, there was a temporal priority for the Jews, but it is also equally given to the Greeks, also equally given to the Gentiles, okay? So Gentiles are not better than the Jews, and the Jews are not better than the Gentiles, even though there was a temporal priority that God was working with the Jewish people. Okay, so you can see there's a lot of important stuff just there in verse 16. A lot of important stuff. Let's move on. Okay, verse 17. All right. So we will be spending most of our time today looking at this phrase, the righteousness of God, the righteousness of God. Okay. All right. And again, I encourage people that if they're watching this and they wanted to follow along in Romans and they want to do their own study with it, it's very, very important that you study Romans with a good modern literal translation. And I would encourage people to use either the New American Standard Version or the New Revised Standard Version, the NASB or the NRSV. Okay, so here we have the phrase. This is from the NASB. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. Okay, so let's talk about that phrase, the righteousness of God. And so it's going to be a little bit technical, but I think you'll be able to follow along. So grammatically, this phrase, God's righteousness or the righteousness of God, is ambiguous. Okay, just a phrase in and of itself doesn't just have one meaning. It could have multiple meanings, okay? And so I'm going to sketch out for you the two primary ways that this is understood by interpreters, okay? All right. Is the righteousness of God God's own righteousness? Is it something that belongs to him? It defines him. It's God's righteousness. Or is it a righteousness from God that God shares with his people? Okay. So you could see in that phrase, the righteousness of God, how it could be the righteousness of God, as in it's God's righteousness. Okay. The subjective genitive is a technical phrase for that, okay? Or is it the righteousness of God, okay? The righteousness that God gives to people, the righteousness that God perhaps shares with his people, the objective genitive, okay? Now, those two phrases are very different. Okay. And if you don't understand the difference between those two phrases, I would encourage you to pause the video and just kind of stop and make sure that you understand the difference between a righteousness that belongs to God in and of himself. It defines him in his own role on one hand, or a righteousness, namely a status that God gives to people. Okay. There's a big difference between the two of those. Okay. And there's a massive difference between God's own righteousness and a righteousness that comes from God to his people. Okay. And one of these is revealed in the preaching of the gospel. Okay. So let me tell you, both of these cannot be true. Both of these cannot be true at the same time. The phrase cannot mean both at the same time. Okay. So even though it's ambiguous, I do think that Paul has one intended meaning in mind. Okay. And so I'm not going to tell you initially what I think the answer is. We're going to go look at the Old Testament and we're going to see example after example after example. So you can see me doing my homework and then you can see how I'm coming to my conclusion. And hopefully you'll find that very persuasive. Okay. So again, this is not me telling you what the word means. We're going to go look at the passages and then you'll be able to see it for yourself. Okay. So without me actually telling you the answer to it, I'll give you the slides and you can look at the passages and you can see, okay, are these passages describing, okay, God's own righteousness and that belongs to him and defines himself, or is this a righteous status that God is giving to his people? Okay, so you can decide for yourself. All right. All right. So the Old Testament context will shed light on what option was intended by Paul. Okay. It doesn't really matter if the word is ambiguous. If we are interpreters of Paul, we have to get behind and ask the question, what did Paul mean by this word? Okay. It doesn't matter what we think. It matters what the author was trying to say. Okay. That's a big difference there. All right. So defining God's righteousness, or defining the righteousness of God. So in the Old Testament, you can do just a word study of all the times that God, or a different word for God, show up together with righteousness. And you're going to see three major points. Okay, this is very important. Okay, number one, God's faithfulness to the covenant with his people. God's righteousness describes God's faithfulness to the covenant with his people. What do I mean by that? So this seems actually to be the primary meaning of God's righteousness, okay? Because at its most basic level, this is important, righteousness as a noun refers to the relationship obligations between two parties. And the most fundamental relationship between God and his people is the covenant. And of course, that covenant in the Old Testament was inaugurated through Abraham, okay? Here's the interesting thing is that I saw this on Facebook and it made me laugh. Someone said that the covenant is not a major theme in the New Testament because it doesn't show, the word covenant doesn't show up that many times. And that is called the word concept fallacy. The word concept fallacy, which suggests that the concept only shows up whenever the specific word appears, despite the fact that the New Testament means new covenant. The books from Matthew to Revelation in our canon are the new covenant. That's what testament means. Okay. But here you should know that the word righteousness, this is a good way for you to kind of help figure things out. Okay. Whether righteousness is God's part or our part. Okay. Righteousness means an obligation between two parties. What is that obligation in the Bible? The obligation between the two parties, between God and his people. That obligation is the covenant. Okay. So righteousness, generally speaking in the Bible, is a covenant word that describes covenant responsibilities between two parties. Okay. So God's righteousness would be God's own faithfulness to that covenant. Okay. That, I'm going to argue, is the primary meaning, the most fundamental meaning of righteousness when it is used to describe God. Okay. Number two, God's righteousness is God's role as the judge in law court settings. Okay. In law court settings. All right. Now, I become aware in teaching this to different cultures that the law court, depending on where you live, is not the same. Okay, I'm not going to assume that you have the same sort of law court that we have over here in the United States. Okay, the Hebrew law court was a little bit different, and so we need to understand law court very carefully without reading in our own ideas of what that is back into the Bible. Okay, so let me make sure that we take some time to describe this. So in the Hebrew law court, we have a judge. Let's put the judge here at the top. Okay, he has responsibilities to both parties. Who are the parties? We have the accuser and we have the accused. Okay, the accuser that will say this person did something that's wrong, this person sinned, and this person over here is saying, oh, I didn't do it, or it wasn't me, or you got the wrong person, or I'm innocent, or that's how it worked. You have the judge at the top, you have the accuser, and you have the accused. Okay, and maybe just even kind of put this into a story that you might be familiar with. Okay, remember when Solomon was acting as the judge when the two women came together and there was a one child, one baby that was dead, another child that was alive, and one woman said, "This is my child," and the other woman says, "No, you took it from me," that sort of thing. So you can see there you've got the judge, and you've got one woman that is accusing another woman of being the guilty party, and the judge has to decide in favor of one party or the other. He has to choose in favor of the accuser or the accused. Okay, so the judge has a role. The judge has responsibility, and the responsibility of the judge is called righteousness. Okay, and the judge has to do four things. Okay, number one, the judge has to be impartial. Okay, he can't be a respecter of persons. He can't respect them because they're rich rather than being poor. He can't respect them because they're Jewish rather than Gentile. He can't respect them because of some sort of bribes or because the judge is corrupt. He has to be impartial. That's number one. That's part of the righteousness of the judge. Number two, the responsibility of the judge that he has to vindicate the innocent person. Okay. And it's very important that in the law court setting, to vindicate someone means that you are justifying them. Justification in a law court setting is to declare an innocent person to be in the right. Okay? That person is not being accused. They're no longer accused of being guilty. They have been justified. They've been declared innocent. They've been vindicated. Okay? All right? So it's very important. Justification in law court is a declaration that someone is innocent. Okay? All right? They're in the right. So that's the second thing. The responsible judge, they have to vindicate the innocent. Number three is that they have to punish the sinner. They've got to deal with evil. Okay, whether the sinner in this is the accuser, what the accuser is saying something about the accused that's wrong. The accuser is lying. They're giving a false testimony, a false witness. Okay, and the judge has to punish that person. Okay, but if the sinner, if the accused person actually is guilty, then the judge has to punish that guilty person. Okay, the judge can't just let the guilty person off. That would make the judge very bad. Okay, and number four, that the judge has to uphold the rules. He has to uphold the law. Okay, and I don't mean by that the law of Moses per se, although that sometimes is part of it. There, the judge has to play by the rules. Okay, if there are laws in place, and the judge has to uphold them. Okay, if God has standards, ordinances, statutes, and commandments, then the judge has to uphold those. Okay, all right. So there, the righteousness, if God is the judge, okay, so in law court settings, then it refers to his responsibilities to be impartial, to vindicate the innocent, to punish the sinner, and to uphold the law. Okay, and so you can already think about this. You can already think, okay, if this is what God is supposed to do in normal law court settings, we're all aware of a very, very important law court setting that involves God as a judge. Okay, we're aware of that because that's going to happen on the final day. And that particular day is called the Day of Judgment. And so this actually leads us to our third meaning of God's righteousness. God's role as the judge on the final day of judgment. Okay, and this is going to be really important. It's going to be really important because remember, Paul said that the righteousness of God is revealed something in regard to the role of the judge on the final day is revealed in the present when somebody believes the gospel. Okay, so we got to think, what does that mean about the final day of judgment, and what does that mean right now in the present? Okay, so this is going to be very similar to number 2. The judge has set a day in which he will judge all persons. He's going to punish the wicked, and he's going to be vindicating the righteous. Okay, and of course, we're aware the Old Testament and the New Testament state that that final judgment, the final day of judgment, will be based according to works. It'll be based according to the entire life of a particular person. All right. Final judgment according to works. Okay. All right. So let's move along. Okay. So let's look at each of these 3 things: God's faithfulness to the covenant, God's responsibility as judge in the law court, and God's responsibility as judge on the final day of judgment. Okay. Let's look at the passages from the Old Testament that talk about these things. And again, you're reading these passages and you are deciding, is the righteousness or the righteous acts, ACTS, or righteous deeds of God, are they describing something that belongs to God in and of himself? Or is this a status of righteousness that God is giving to his people? Okay, you're reading the passages and you're making your own mind up. Okay, all right. All right, so let's look at passages to talk about God's faithfulness to the covenant with his people. Okay, so here in Judges, it says, at the sound of those who divide flocks among the watering of the places, there they shall recount the righteous deeds of Yahweh, the righteous deeds for his peasantry in Israel. So there, as they are sitting there in peace in the promised land, and they're at their watering places, they're going to sit there and they're going to recount all the good, righteous things that God has done for them, all the things that God has done in God's role as the initiator of the covenant. And they're going to recount them. They are going to think over all the good things that God has done for them. Okay. Here's another passage, Psalm 103. But the loving kindness of Yahweh is from everlasting to everlasting on those who fear him. And in parallelism to loving kindness, his righteousness to children's children, to those who keep his covenant and remember his precepts to do them. Okay, so there you can see that God's righteousness, another way of describing his loving kindness, which is just a big fancy word in Hebrew, the now chesed, which means covenant faithfulness. God's covenant faithfulness, his righteousness, is given to those who keep his covenant and those who remember his precepts. Okay, so there you can see that righteousness involves the covenant. Okay, and God is going to be faithful with those things. And here's this very interesting passage from Daniel, to where Daniel is praying and repenting on behalf of the evil that his people have committed. So look, it's one of the greatest prayers I think in the entire Bible. Okay, and I don't even have the room to read all of it there. So here in Daniel 9, he says, I prayed to Yahweh my God and confessed and said, alas, O Lord, the great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant and loving kindness for those who love him and keep his commandments. We have sinned, committing iniquity, acted wickedly, and rebelled, even turning aside from your commandments and ordinances. Moreover, we have not listened to your servants, the prophets, who spoke in your name to our kings, our princes, our fathers, and all the people of the land. Righteousness belongs to you, O Lord, but to us open shame. Okay? So notice there, okay, God is the one who keeps his covenant and loving kindness, that word that means covenant faithfulness. God keeps his covenant faithfulness to people, meaning righteousness belongs to God. God's righteousness is his faithfulness to the covenant. And notice that the response to the people is that they are supposed to keep God's commandments. But did they do that? No, they didn't. And he's honest. We have sinned. We have turned aside. We did not listen to your servants, the prophets. They came and they spoke to our kings. They spoke to our princes and our ancestors, the fathers, and we now have open shame. It's a very honest, genuine, authentic prayer where the where the petitioner is being honest. He's saying, look, God, you've been faithful to us and you punished us. You've been faithful. We've been disobedient. And now this is where we're at. Okay. But you can see there that we see righteousness language used for God's covenant with the people. Okay. Let's look at the next example. Okay. Number 2, God's role as the judge in law court settings. Okay. So here in Psalm 72, the one who sings says, give the king your judgments, O God, and your righteousness to the king's son. May he judge your people with righteousness and your afflicted with justice. Let the mountains bring peace to the people and the hills in righteousness. May he, the king, vindicate the afflicted of the people, save the children of the needy, and crush the oppressor. So you can see there the role of the judge. You can see there that he's got to vindicate the afflicted. He's got to save the needy. He's got to crush the evildoer. Okay, so this is God. God has his own judgments as the judge. And notice there that they're described in parallelism. Your judgments are your righteousness. Okay, and this person is saying, let your king, the Davidic king, whether it's Saul or David or Solomon, or even the ultimate king, Jesus, God, may your king judge in the way that you judge. Okay, because we know that when God judges, he vindicates the afflicted. He vindicates the needy, but he also deals with evil. He crushes the oppressor. Okay, but there you can see the judgments of the judge are paralleled with the righteousness of the judge. Okay, here we go, Isaiah 41, verse 10 through 11. Do not fear, this is God speaking, for I am with you. Do not anxiously look about you, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. Surely I will help you. Surely I will uphold you with my righteous right arm. Okay. What does God's righteous right arm mean when he is helping and strengthening his people? Behold, all those who are angered at you will be shamed and dishonored. Those who contend with you will be as nothing and will perish. Okay, this is God taking his seat as the judge, and God is rescuing and vindicating his afflicted people, and God is crushing and destroying the accuser, those who are afflicting the innocent people. Okay, you can see that God, in doing this, and God being the judge, he upholds them with his righteous right hand. Okay, righteousness there, or the adjective righteous, is being used to describe the role of the judge, to vindicate the innocent and to punish evil. All right. Micah chapter 7, verse 9, I will bear the indignation of Yahweh because I have sinned against him until he pleads my case and executes justice for me. He will bring me out to the light and I will see his righteousness. There's God, okay, pleading the case, executing justice as the judge, even though this person has sinned, okay, he's hoping that God's going to plead his case, and we're going to see the righteousness of God, the judge. Okay, so there you can see righteousness being used of the judge in law court settings. Okay, but of course, if God has a general law court, we know that that is going to extend into the final day of judgment. Okay, I hope you're all still with me here. Okay, hopefully you're all following along. You're not completely lost. This one I think is probably the easiest to see because I think people already come and agree that God is going to be a just judge on the final day of judgment. Okay, you know what's interesting is that the passages that talk about the justice of God as on the final day of judgment, they're mostly in the Psalms. They're mostly in the Psalms, which is interesting because that's not the kind of thing that Christians like to worship about. Christians like to worship, and they like to, at least in modern worship songs, they like to sing it about God as if God is their boyfriend. It's this kind of romantic type of love. And man, I mean, imagine we were singing songs like this. Like I want to sing a worship song that sounds like this. But Yahweh abides forever. He has established his throne for judgment. He will judge the world in righteousness. He will execute judgment for the peoples with equity. That's in the Psalms. Okay, so that's the final day of judgment. He's going to judge the world in righteousness from his throne for judgment. Psalm 96. Before Yahweh, he is coming. He is coming to judge the earth. He will judge the world in righteousness and the peoples in his faithfulness. Okay, not just the Israelites, not just the Jews, the entire world, all the peoples. Okay, notice that the righteousness of the judge is described in the parallelism as his faithfulness as the judge on that final day. More from the Psalm, Psalm 98. Before Yahweh, he is coming to judge the earth. He will judge the world with righteousness and the peoples with equity. There, judgment, righteousness, the act of the judge, that is clear. That's a final day of judgment, okay? And then we have a picture here of what judgment looks like from an apocalyptic standpoint, from the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 7. Okay. All right, so this is it's not going to use righteousness language, but you're going to see here in this vision of judgment, of a future judgment, how God is going to vindicate the innocent and God is going to punish evil. Okay. All right. So here it's the writer has a vision. The fourth beast will be a fourth kingdom on the earth, which will be different from all the other kingdoms, and it will devour the whole earth and tread it down and crush it. This little horn from the fourth kingdom will speak out against the Most High and wear down the saints of the highest one. They will be given into his hand, but the court will sit for judgment, and his dominion will be taken away, annihilated and destroyed forever. Then the sovereignty, the dominion, and the greatness of all the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be given to the people of the saints of the highest one. What a great kingdom promise, by the way. Okay. All the sovereignty and the dominion and the greatness of all the kingdoms under the whole heaven, everything under heaven, will be given to the people of the saints of the highest one, namely God. Okay. That's a promise to you. Okay. All that stuff's going to be given to you. Okay. But that happens after the judgment, to where the wicked person is annihilated and destroyed forever. Notice they're not burning forever and ever in a lake of fire. They are annihilated and destroyed forever. Okay, but that's the judgment. We've got a wicked person. The court sits for judgment. Okay, the wicked is destroyed, and the righteous people are vindicated, and they're given what's promised to them. They're promised all the kingdoms under heaven. Okay. All right, so you can see there that God is functioning as the judge there, even though we don't have righteousness language actually appearing. Okay. All right, so those are our passages. Okay, so let's summarize. What did we just look at? Okay. All right, so, because again, we're trying to figure out how do we define the righteousness of God? Since the righteousness of God seems to refer to God's own role in his faithfulness to the covenant, God's own role as the judge of the law court between the righteous and the wicked, and God's future role as the cosmic judge on the day of judgment. And here we're going to see, if you've been following along, then it seems overwhelmingly persuasive to take the phrase, the righteousness of God, to refer to God's own righteousness, not a righteousness that God shares with his people. Okay? Hopefully you have come to the same conclusion, because that is overwhelmingly what those passages are saying. Okay? How does this work? Okay? As the creator and the initiator of the covenant, that role can't be shared with the people. His people take the other role as the beneficiaries of the covenant agreement that God struck. Okay, so I just want you to think about this. God is the creator, and God initiated the covenant. God can't take that role and share it with the other party. They take the other end of the agreement, okay? They also can't be the initiator and the creator of the covenant. Only one person can have that. Okay, so you can see how God's righteousness, namely his faithfulness to the covenant, is not something that he shares with his people. It's something that belongs to himself. Also, as the judge, remember the judge up here, between the righteous and the wicked party, that judge does not share his responsibilities with the vindicated party. The judge, who's supposed to be impartial, to defend the innocent, to punish evil, and to uphold the law. That's not something that the innocent person does. They're not the judge in that category. They're being judged. They're being vindicated, but the judge does not share that role with someone who's being vindicated. It's not how it works. The judge is doing his own thing. So to me, I don't understand how the phrase, the righteousness of God, could possibly mean a righteous status that God shares with his people. And yet, that is how it's been translated in some translations. I think the NIV does that. I think the NIV says a righteousness from God, namely a righteous status that God shares with his people. There's no way that's what the phrase could mean based on its Old Testament context. And then as we continue to read through Romans, we're going to see that that just doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. So, how do we take this phrase, God's righteousness, namely God's own righteousness? How do we take that and translate it in a way that takes into account God's faithfulness to the covenant, God's role as the judge in the law court, and the bringer of justice on the last day? How do we take all those things together? So this is my best guess at this. And this is not my own. I actually got this from N.T. Wright. God's own righteousness seems to be his faithful covenant justice. God's righteousness is his faithful covenant justice. It's like it's linking all the terms together. He's being faithful, he's demonstrating his covenant loyalty, and he's dealing out justice. Okay? Faithful covenant justice. Okay? Maybe that made things easier for you in understanding God's own righteousness. Maybe you're thinking, that's just too many words. That's just too much. The point is, this is an important word. It's an important phrase. And Paul has a lot of meaning behind it. And we need to do our best to wrap our minds around what it means and the implication it's going to have for Paul's argument in Romans. Okay. All right. So we just learned that the righteousness of God means God's faithful covenant justice, his own faithfulness to the covenant. And what we're seeing here in Romans 1:17 is that all of this is revealed. It's revealed in the gospel. When Paul preaches the gospel to someone in the marketplace and that person responds with faith, then God's righteousness, his faithful covenant justice, is being revealed using this apocalypse word. It's being unveiled in the present. What does that mean? Why is this revelation word being used here? So God's righteousness, his faithful covenant justice, wherein he declares someone to be a member of his covenant family, declares them to be righteous and vindicated in judgment, that declaration has been revealed in the present. I'm going to say that again, okay? So God's righteousness, wherein he declares someone to be a member of his covenant family, he declares that person to be righteous, he declares that person vindicated in judgment. That declaration has now been revealed in the present when someone believes the gospel. This suggests that the verdict of the final day, wherein someone is marked out as God's righteous people, can be seen in the present by those who believe the gospel. In other words, you can know today, right now, who is going to get a favorable verdict on the last day by someone. You're not looking at them and saying, oh, are they Jewish? You're not looking at them and thinking, oh, are they circumcised? You're looking at them and saying, are they demonstrating faithfulness? Because if they're demonstrating faithfulness, God's righteousness is already being revealed, and the verdict of the final day can already be seen in the present. And guess what? Guess what this means? It means that the already and the not yet are as basic as the saving gospel message, despite my critics who say that I am making up this theology and I'm importing it and forcing it into the Bible. This is something that is as basic and foundational as salvation, at least for Paul. The verdict of the last day is revealed in the present for those who have faith, loyalty, allegiance. Those people right now, we can look at those people and say those people are going to get a favorable verdict on the last day, because the favorable verdict is being revealed in the present for those who demonstrate faith. There you go. That's the already and the not yet. All right, passage goes on. It talks about that it's revealed from faith to faith, okay? From faith to faith. What does this mean, okay? So the way in which God's righteousness is revealed in the present, when someone believes the gospel, is described here as from faith to faith, okay? And this is really important that you understand how this works. And it indicates a beginning point with God's faithfulness to his people to deal with sin. God begins the covenant. God initiates a covenant. The covenant with Abraham was made in order to bring a blessing to this world to deal with sin, to deal with evil, okay? And so God initiated that. So it began with God's faith. It began with God's faithfulness, okay? But the response of God's people is that of faithfulness. They respond to God's faithful covenant initiative with their own faithfulness. What are they having faith in? They have faithfulness to the gospel and to the covenant's terms. What are the covenant's terms? The teachings of Jesus. So when it says from faith to faith, it means beginning with God's faithful initiative to save, to redeem, to vindicate. And we respond with our own faith from God's faithfulness to our faithfulness. God begins it. We respond with our own faithfulness, okay? So God is faithful specifically to the covenant, to deal with sin, to deal with evil. We respond by faith to the terms of the covenant, and the terms of the covenant now are to the teachings of Jesus, to the gospel that Jesus preached. Okay, that's what it means from faith to faith. Okay, here's how I know the NIV has gone the wrong way. The NIV will translate this phrase from faith to faith, from first to last. What? From first to last? What? That doesn't even make any sense. It's like it's like the translator, I think, has just taken a wrong turn in the understanding of what Paul is saying. But it's again, if we understand the covenant and God's faithfulness to the covenant, we can see from God's faithfulness to our faithfulness. Okay, just as it is written, but the righteous one shall live by faith. Okay, and that's the phrase we have to look at right here. So Paul here is citing Habakkuk 2:4. Okay, and in Habakkuk 2:4, God is speaking. God is the one who's saying, but the righteous one shall live by faith. Okay, and God is declaring that a righteous person will live by faithfulness. Okay, so this is the person there, Habakkuk, is wondering, hey, bad things are happening. The Chaldeans are coming and they're attacking us. How are we supposed to respond? Okay, and God, caring for his people, looking to vindicate his people, God answers the prophet, but God is speaking, and he describes the response of someone who is righteous. Okay, someone who is right in the covenant. Okay, and that person lives by faith, by faithfulness. And so this is actually very interesting. This passage here, Habakkuk 2:4, is an Old Testament reference to a righteous status. Righteousness is said of someone who is demonstrating faithfulness. Okay, and you have to think about this in the context of the Old Testament. God is saying that someone is righteous by their faith rather than by obedience to the Torah of Moses. In the Old Testament, God describes righteous behavior here by someone who is demonstrating faith and faithfulness, okay? Not by observing tribal laws, okay? And this anticipates another reference that's going to show up in Romans, and it's going to be foundational, where Abraham believed, namely he had demonstrated faithfulness to God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness in Genesis 15:6. And of course, that is the way that the covenant originally began, which is that people were defined as members of God's family. They were righteous. They had covenant membership because of their faith, not because of their race. So Paul is well aware of these passages from the Old Testament, Habakkuk 2:4 and Genesis 15:6. But the point here is that Paul is able to cite this passage in order to demonstrate his point. This is what God has been interested in all along. This is God's plan. This is what God has been up to ever since the beginning. God has wanted to create a worldwide family, and through that family to deal with the sin of the world, to deal with evil, to deal with death. Okay. And God has wanted them to be defined by faithfulness, by loyalty, by allegiance, by obedience. Okay. All right. So three applications of ways we can take this purpose statement of Romans and apply it to our lives. Number one, for Paul to address the Roman culture with another gospel about a different Son of God who has inaugurated peace, salvation, and a kingdom is to boldly speak forth a message that is deeply controversial, seditious, and unpopular. However, Paul sets himself up as an example for readers by stating that he is not ashamed of the gospel. So let us draw motivation from Paul's courage and look for ways to share the gospel of the kingdom, even when it is unpopular or divisive. Paul preaching his message to Rome was incredibly unpopular and divisive. It would have been accepted, obviously, in the Roman church, but the point is that Paul is saying that your kingdom, the Roman Empire, is not a real kingdom. Okay? Your Son of God, Caesar, not the real Son of God. Jesus is the true Son of God. Your salvation is a sham. The real salvation is what Jesus brings by dealing with evil and death. The peace that God gives, already inaugurated now, but ultimately to be seen worldwide when the kingdom is consummated, that's the real peace. So that was controversial. But Paul was not ashamed of the gospel when he had lots of reasons to be. So let's also draw encouragement from Paul. Number two, in the gospel, God's faithful covenant justice, namely his own righteousness, is being revealed in the present. We can tell who presently will be given a righteous, justified verdict on the final day of judgment, in which everyone will be judged according to their works, by nothing other than a commitment of faith or faithfulness. And so, you know what? This is good news because we can have peace and assurance if we are faithful. We've had some recent discussion in our church community about assurance of salvation. You can have peace and assurance if you are being faithful, because the verdict of the last day that you are righteous, you are a member of my people, you are a member of my covenant people, you are vindicated on the day of judgment. That verdict is revealed in the present when someone believes the gospel, demonstrating their belief, their faithfulness, and their fidelity. And so we can have peace, we can have assurance. You can have assurance and peace if you're being faithful. I think that's good. I think that's good news. Okay. Okay. Number three, Paul lastly portrayed the relationship between the covenant God and sinful people as from faith to faith. This indicates that God initiates the faithful covenant relationship, and we are motivated / persuaded by God's love to live out our own faithfulness to his commands. And so if you have trouble being faithful to God, you have trouble obeying Jesus, you have trouble with the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount, then I want you just to think about and meditate upon what God has and is doing for you right now. Because our faith is persuaded and motivated by God's own faithfulness. And so if we're not motivated to be faithful, then we need to think a little bit more about what God has done for us. And that should overwhelmingly motivate and persuade us to be obedient, to be faithful, to be allegiant. There you go. That's all I got for you. Hopefully you got something out of that. Stop sharing here. And okay, let's open some things up for questions and comments. Looks like Dean has his hand raised first.
Yeah, this is really interesting. And going back, you did answer my question at the end, because I was always wondering what it meant, where it says God is revealed from, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. That always confused me. I never understood that before. So it begins with God's faithfulness to his covenant, and then our faithfulness to keep the commandments of God via his son, Jesus Christ.
Absolutely. 100%. A plus.
But I read that for years and years and could never make any sense. I didn't understand that at all. So thanks for the teaching.
Happy to help you there. Okay. I'm going to go to George and then to Paul.
Hey, Dustin, I just wanted to say that thanks for this teaching, and you threw so much information at me. I kind of just baffled myself in my notes and mixed everything up. I just wanted to know, when is there a time when you're going to post this on YouTube so I can watch it again?
Yeah, I'll probably post it by the end of the day.
All right, great. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you. All right, Paul, you're up.
First of all, thank you very much for that, Dustin. I thought that was really good. You know that I have been through Romans recently, but I think you added something to it there. I mean, the first thing that I was thinking about was, as I was listening there, was about the term righteousness. It really is a status. You know, God's faithfulness towards the covenant, his doing his part, keeping his promises in the covenant. That is his status. When he does that, is righteous. And our status, when we are faithful to our part in the covenant, when we, faithful is continually believing and trusting. And if we believe that Jesus is our Lord, and if Lord means someone to whom you belong and who's got the right to say what it is you should or should not be doing, and he has done so, as you say in Sermon on the Mount, then our works come about from obeying the commandments we've had from Jesus, and we'll be judged by those. And if we've done our part in the covenant, if we've obeyed those commandments and have been faithful there, then we are declared righteous. And we can be righteous right now, just as we hopefully will then. We could depart from righteousness, which I hope that nobody here does. But we can be righteous now, as you say, in the here and now, and we can be righteous there. And the declaration from God, who can judge us because he does not sin, that's the one, the final one that matters, that decides whether we are going to be in the forever kingdom or not. So I was just reflecting on those things as we went along, and I thought that was really good teaching, and I'll be looking at the presentation again as well, just to let it properly sink in and just become a real deep part of the way I live every day. So thanks, Dustin.
Yeah, that's good. I always feel good when people respond to me and I nod my head with everything they say, because I feel like, okay, I've accurately portrayed what I've wanted to say to people. And this is a tough concept. Let's be honest. I don't think it's tough. It's there's a little complexity to it. I get that. I think you also made a good point that we're going to see it a little bit more in Romans as we continue to move on, is that righteousness, or us being righteous, is a status in the covenant. But I think most Christians, if you were to ask them, what does it mean to be righteous? They will say it means to be moral. They think of it as a moral category of, I'm doing good things. I'm morally right. Like I'm righteous as I'm moral, or I'm wicked as I'm amoral. But that's the wrong set of categories. It's a covenant relationship category, which will make you look like you're doing moral things. But to think of it strictly as morality outside of the covenant is to miss the point.
Yeah.
And I think that's
hopefully our morality is based on the covenant.
Right. That's the thing. The covenant comes first. Again, you could see why, if you try to understand righteousness and all of these words, righteous, or even justify, and you don't have a firm understanding of what the covenant is, you're lost. Yep. You're and this is why I don't, well, Okay, that would be too bold. I'll say that up on my tongue. Okay, so
Thanks, Dustin. I really
okay.
appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks for your comment. I appreciate that. All right, go ahead, Donna.
Loved it. I was just thinking, wow. I feel like that Virginia Slim commercial. Of course, the young people probably in this church probably don't remember that commercial, where I've come a long way, baby, is the phrase, but that would not have happened on my own from the way that I was originally taught. I'm not going to belabor that, the era, but I do so appreciate you sparsing out and teasing out the things, the stuff of the covenant, and correctly thinking of this. I was thrilled as I listened to you. I'm going to go back and rework it because it's just, there's a lot in there, Dustin. And yes, to their own ruin, a lot of people do not understand it because preachers do not teach it correctly. They water it down to their own ruin. And people don't understand the covenant. So, you know, I'm just thrilled. I mean, my mind is still reeling. I love the understanding of the imperial status of, you know, the gods that they worship, the imperial laws that they followed, you know, knowing that the emperor was considered the son of God and where Paul was, that really brings a lot of focus. You know, to me, it brings a lot of clarity as to what Romans is all about. I don't understand it all, but I have a greater understanding thanks to the work that you're doing, and just getting it right in my understanding of the covenant and faith. I mean, my words cannot do justice, Dustin, to what I'm thinking, but I appreciate you very much. Thank you for all your hard work. Really, it has made such a difference in the way that I now interpret the book of Romans. I had some very awkward understanding of Romans. I know I did, you know, it's kind of like, I know there's some things that I believe that aren't really true, but I don't know what those are until I work it with somebody, you know, that, you know, has a clearer understanding to present it to me. And then I rework it and change my understanding and my beliefs centered around what is more true of the book of Romans. So, you know, I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's very kind of you. I appreciate that. Well, I learn new things about this all the time, and I hope we can continue to learn together as we work through Romans. And I'm okay going through it at a slower pace because I think it's very rich in the truth of God. But as I'm also starting to see that people have a little bit that they have to dig out of kind of their own previous teachings, and I think giving people time and space to do that, I think will be helpful for learning. So we'll work through this together. Okay, we'll go to Phyllis and Steve, and then we'll go to the prayers.
I'm just echoing what everybody has been saying. And without even realizing it, I had a lot of this stuff mixed up. And it has just meant so much to go back through this and bringing in those Old Testament scriptures and actually letting the scriptures define what it is. And I think as a result, even when we take communion later, I'll look at it in terms of the blood covenant, and which came from God and his son. And it just makes you look at everything different, just slowing it down and looking at everything different. Steve had told me about once when he was a kid, he went on a nature tour with his class. And he said they went all through the tour, and at the end of the trail, the tour guide asked them, what did you see? And he said they were all saying, we saw trees, we saw this, we saw that. And he said, the guide said, okay. But he said, this time we're gonna go back through. And this time I'm gonna show you some things. And how shocked they were at what they didn't see. and what they had missed. And this is how I'm feeling now. When it comes to this whole thing, this whole kingdom thing, this whole righteousness and everything. I mean, it really is like you're seeing things you've never seen or considered before. And it's a real humbling thing. I mean, you look at this through humbled eyes, and all you can say is, thank you, God. And I appreciate all the work that you have put into this, as well as all of our teachers. I am so appreciative. Thank you.
That's a good example. I appreciate that. I hope people can relate to that in many of their own stories and experiences in life. Okay, we'll give the Pereiras the last word of the day.
Yes, Dustin, where in the last part of verse 17, where it says, the righteous man shall live by faith. You think like when it says live by faith, it is teaching us that it is not a one-time, belief, but it is a lifestyle. Like you have to live by this. I'm asking this because when I used to be, when I used to believe, once saved, always saved, this used to kind of throw me off a little, where it says live by faith, and in Habakkuk it says live by his faith. So I just wanted your comment on that. Like, does that show that live, it shows the lifestyle?
Yeah, I do think I think that's one part of it. I wasn't going to go much more detailed into it. There's a little bit more with Paul. I mean, here's the thing. Paul is not in his mind thinking of, okay, I need passages that talk about righteousness and faith. And let me just kind of flip through my Old Testament in my mind and draw the passages that I know. The way that he's going to unpack the book of Romans is actually going to draw upon Habakkuk and the story of Habakkuk, and how Habakkuk uses this passage to answer the problem of Habakkuk, and how Habakkuk goes and demonstrates how God is dealing with this. But yeah, so I think short answer is yes. I do think that obviously live as a lifestyle, but think about this here too. Okay, later in Romans, Paul is going to describe our life, like in the sense of conversion, as a dying with Christ in Romans chapter 6. Okay. We have died with Christ. We have been buried with Christ in baptism. And now, just as Christ has been raised from the dead, we have been raised to newness of life. Okay. So another way that living implies living as covenant members, living as people of God, living as people that have responded to the gospel, who are submitting to the lordship of Jesus. Obviously, we are living because we're breathing air and we have oxygen flowing and blood flowing and everything else. So I think when Paul is using that, he knows that he's going to do a lot more with this phrase living than might just kind of generally be at the surface. But we have to wait for the rest of Romans to kind of see what more he does with that. So like I said, short answer, yes, but there's a lot more there that Paul is going to show us. He's going to, again, this is just a summary statement. Now we got the rest of Romans to see how he unpacks it.
Right. Thank you.
Sure. Awesome. All right. All right. Good deal. Hey, if you're watching this, we'd love to have you in fellowship so we can minister to you and you can minister to us. Check us out in the description below to find out ways that you can get in contact with us, and love to have you. Hopefully you've been blessed by this teaching. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day. God bless you and have a good 2022.